Ayanna Crow. Feather's bare feet scraped against the wooden altar steps, iron shackles cutting into her wrists as Judge Whitehorse's gavel struck 3 times. The crowd's murmur died instantly. By the authority vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I pronounce you wife to the mountain man known as Dakota Stone Bear. The words hung in the desert air like a death sentence. Mrs. Henderson's gasp pierced the silence, her hand flying to her throat. A child began crying somewhere in the crowd, and the sound of wooden benches creaking filled the makeshift courthouse as people shifted uncomfortably. Ayanna's father, Chief Nathan Crow Feather, stood rigid by the door, his weathered face a mask hiding the breaking of his heart. She remembered his gentle hands braiding her hair just yesterday morning, whispering Apache lullabies. "Take her now before I change my mind," the judge commanded, his voice cutting through her memories like a blade. What they didn't know was that this so-called savage would save more than just her life. But first, she had to survive what came next. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. The year was 1887. And the Arizona Territory stretched endlessly under a merciless sun that had witnessed countless injustices, but none quite like this. Copper Canyon sat like a festering wound between the white settlement and the Apache reservation, where 2 worlds collided in a dance of mistrust and survival. The town itself was nothing more than a collection of sun-bleached buildings and broken dreams, where justice was whatever Judge Ezekiel Whitehorse declared it to be. Ayanna Crow Feather had never imagined her 19 years would lead to this moment. Born to Chief Nathan Crow Feather, she was the bridge between worlds her father had hoped would heal old wounds. He had sent her to the white man's school in Tucson, where she learned to read Shakespeare and write in perfect cursive, believing education would protect her. Her dark eyes held the wisdom of her ancestors and the sharp intelligence of someone who had mastered 2 languages, 2 cultures, 2 ways of seeing the world. But none of that mattered now, not with the life growing inside her belly. Not with the shame burning her cheeks as the townspeople stared. The father of her unborn child was David Whitehorse, the judge's golden-haired son who had whispered promises of love behind the schoolhouse and sworn they would marry when the time was right. David had vanished the night she told him about the baby, leaving only a hastily scrawled note claiming he had joined a cattle drive to California. 3 days later, Judge Whitehorse announced his son had died in a tragic accident, trampled by spooked horses in a thunderstorm. Judge Ezekiel Whitehorse ruled Copper Canyon with an iron fist wrapped in legal documents. A tall, imposing man with steel-gray hair and eyes like winter ice, he had arrived 5 years earlier with his young Apache wife, Morning Star. The townspeople respected him for bringing law to their chaotic corner of the territory, never questioning his methods too closely. His wife had died suddenly 2 winters ago, and since then, something had hardened in him, something that made even brave men look away when he spoke. Dakota Stone Bear was a ghost story told around campfires, a legend whispered in frightened voices. Standing 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad as an oak tree, he lived alone in the desert mountains where even the Apache feared to tread. Veterans from the Indian Wars claimed he had eaten the hearts of fallen enemies, that he could disappear into rock and shadow like smoke. His long black hair was streaked with premature silver, and his face bore scars from battles both physical and spiritual. Some said he was Apache. Others claimed he was white, but all agreed he was dangerous. Chief Nathan Crow Feather carried the weight of his people's survival on his shoulders. Every decision he made could mean life or death for the 300 souls under his protection. When Judge Whitehorse came to him with his ultimatum, the old chief's choice was no choice at all. The morning Ayanna discovered she was carrying David's child, the desert bloomed with rare wildflowers after an unexpected spring rain. She had been sick for weeks, attributing it to worry about her future. But when Mrs. Patterson, the white doctor's wife, confirmed her suspicions with knowing eyes and gentle hands, the world tilted on its axis. Ayanna's first instinct was joy. She and David had talked about children, about the beautiful babies they would make together, bridges between their two worlds. She found David behind the old mission church where they always met, his blue eyes bright with excitement about some new adventure. "I'm with child," she whispered, expecting him to sweep her into his arms and declare their engagement. Instead, his face drained of color like water from a broken jar. "Are you certain?" he stammered, backing away as if her words were poison arrows. When she nodded, tears already forming, he ran his hands through his golden hair and began pacing like a caged animal. "My father will kill me," David whispered, his voice cracking. "He's already angry about us meeting. If he finds out about this—" He stopped pacing and grabbed her shoulders, his fingers digging into her flesh. "You have to get rid of it, Ayanna. There are ways. Old women who know things." The words hit her like physical blows, and she wrenched away from him, her hand instinctively protecting her still flat belly. "This is our child," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "You promised me we would marry. You said you loved me." David's laugh was bitter and cold, nothing like the warm laughter she had fallen in love with. "I thought I did, but this changes everything. I can't marry you now. My father has plans for me, important plans. I can't throw away my future for a moment of weakness." That night David disappeared like morning mist. Ayanna waited behind the mission for 3 days, hoping he would come to his senses, that love would triumph over fear. On the 4th day, Judge Whitehorse himself came to the reservation, his face a mask of righteous fury. He carried a crumpled letter that he claimed was found in David's belongings after the tragic accident. "My son is dead because of your daughter's witchcraft," Judge Whitehorse declared to Chief Nathan, his voice echoing across the gathered tribal council. "She seduced him with Apache magic, drove him to madness and death. Justice demands payment." The letter, supposedly in David's handwriting, spoke of being unable to live with the shame of his weakness, of choosing death over dishonor. Chief Nathan's weathered face remained impassive, but Ayanna could see the doubt flickering in his dark eyes. The tribe had been walking a razor's edge for years, trying to maintain peace with the white authorities while preserving their way of life. Any excuse could bring the cavalry down upon them, and Judge Whitehorse held their fate in his pale hands. "What justice do you seek?" Chief Nathan asked, though Ayanna could see he already knew the answer would be terrible. Judge Whitehorse smiled, and it was like watching a snake bare its fangs. "The girl has brought death to my family. Now she must face the consequences of her actions. There is a man in the mountains, Takota Stone Bear. He has need of a wife to cook and clean and bear his children. She will go to him, and her shame will be removed from both our peoples." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind through the cottonwood trees. Ayanna felt her world crumbling like ancient pottery. Takota Stone Bear was more than just a hermit. He was death itself, the boogeyman that mothers used to frighten disobedient children. Stories said he had killed so many men that their bones carpeted his land like fallen leaves. "If I refuse?" Chief Nathan asked quietly. Then the territorial government will investigate the suspicious death of a prominent citizen's son on your land. I'm afraid the evidence might suggest that your people were involved in murder." Judge Whitehorse's meaning was clear: refuse, and the tribe would be destroyed. That night, Ayanna lay on her sleeping mat, listening to her father and the tribal elders debate her fate in hushed voices. Some argued for resistance, for fighting, rather than sacrificing one of their own. Others, led by her father, spoke of the greater good, of the hundreds of lives that hung in the balance. By dawn, the decision was made. The marriage ceremony was a mockery of both Apache and white traditions, conducted in the courthouse with Ayanna in shackles like a common criminal. Judge Whitehorse presided with obvious satisfaction, pronouncing sentence as if he were ordering an execution. When Dakota Stone Bear finally appeared in the doorway, even the bravest men in the room took a step back. He was exactly as the stories described, tall as a pine tree, silent as death, with eyes that had seen too much blood. The journey to Dakota's mountain refuge passed in terrifying silence. Ayanna rode behind him on his massive black horse, her shackled wrists finally freed, but her spirit still in chains. The desert landscape grew increasingly desolate as they climbed higher into the Dragoon Mountains, where Apache legends spoke of spirits that devoured the souls of the living. Dakota never once looked back at her, never spoke, never even acknowledged her existence beyond ensuring she didn't fall from the horse. When they finally reached his dwelling as the sun painted the sky blood red, Ayanna's heart nearly stopped. The remote cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by towering saguaro cacti. But what made her stomach turn were the white objects scattered around the property like macabre decorations. Bones, human bones, bleached clean by the desert sun, some still bearing scraps of clothing that fluttered in the evening breeze like prayer flags of the dead. Dakota dismounted with fluid grace and simply pointed toward the cabin door before leading his horse toward a crude shelter built against the rock face. No words, no explanation, no acknowledgement that he had just brought a pregnant woman to what appeared to be a charnel house. Ayanna stood frozen in the gathering darkness, her hand protectively covering her belly as she counted at least a dozen skulls grinning at her from various perches around the clearing. The cabin door creaked open at her tentative push, revealing a single room that was surprisingly clean and well organized. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, already laid with kindling. Simple furniture crafted from desert ironwood filled the space. A sturdy table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed covered with woven blankets. Shelves lined the walls, holding jars of preserved foods, tools, and what appeared to be medical supplies. It was the home of someone who valued function over comfort, survival over luxury. That first night, Ayanna barricaded herself inside while Dakota made his camp outside under the stars. She had expected him to force himself upon her immediately. Wasn't that why Judge Whitehorse had sent her here? But as dawn broke without incident, she began to wonder if the mountain man was simply biding his time, studying his prey before striking. On the second day, she discovered the truth was far more horrifying. While exploring the area around the cabin, staying close enough to run if needed, she found a partially buried cache of human remains. Her scream brought Dakota running from wherever he had been, and for the first time she saw something almost like concern flicker across his scarred features. He followed her pointing finger to the grisly discovery, then simply nodded as if finding corpses was as mundane as finding firewood. But it was what happened next that shattered all her preconceptions. Instead of threatening her or displaying the savage brutality she expected, Dakota knelt beside the remains and began to carefully, almost reverently, cover them with stones in what appeared to be a burial cairn. His movements were gentle, ritualistic, speaking of respect rather than the callous disregard of a killer disposing of victims. Ayanna watched in growing confusion as this supposed monster performed what could only be described as funeral rites. When he finished, he stood and looked directly at her for the first time since their arrival. His dark eyes held depths of pain she had never imagined, and when he opened his mouth as if to speak, no sound emerged. She realized with shocking clarity that Dakota Stone Bear was mute. The revelation transformed her understanding entirely. The terrible silence she had attributed to menace was actually inability. The bones around his property took on a different meaning. Perhaps these were not victims, but people he had tried to save, or enemies who had threatened others. The medical supplies in the cabin suggested knowledge of healing rather than harming. Over the following days, a strange routine developed between them. Dakota would disappear before dawn, returning at sunset with game or gathered plants. He never entered the cabin while she was inside, instead leaving food and supplies on the wooden table outside. Ayanna began to notice the careful way he arranged things, always ensuring she had what she needed without forcing interaction. The breakthrough came when she discovered him one evening sitting by a small fire, using a sharp knife to carve something from a piece of seasoned wood. As she watched from the cabin doorway, she saw delicate shapes emerging. A tiny cradle, perfectly proportioned and smooth as silk. His large, scarred hands worked with surprising gentleness, creating something beautiful for her unborn child. When he noticed her watching, Dakota froze like a wild animal caught in the open. Slowly, carefully, Ayanna stepped outside and sat across the fire from him. In the flickering light, she studied his face properly for the first time. The scars that marked his features told stories of violence, but his eyes held a gentleness that contradicted every tale told about him in the settlements below. "You cannot speak?" she said softly. Not a question, but a statement of understanding. He nodded once, his hand still gripping the half-finished cradle. "But you understand everything I say." Another nod, this one accompanied by something that might have been relief. Ayanna reached out slowly and touched the carved wood, marveling at its craftsmanship. "This is beautiful. Thank you." For the first time since David's betrayal, she felt tears that weren't born of despair. Here in this wilderness, surrounded by the bones of the dead, she had found unexpected kindness from the last person she would have expected to offer it. That night, for the first time since her arrival, Dakota slept inside the cabin. He made his bed by the fireplace while she took the proper bed, but the barrier between them had begun to crumble. As she drifted off to sleep, Ayanna realized that perhaps the greatest monsters weren't always the ones who looked fearsome from the outside. The morning Ayanna woke to find blood soaking through her nightgown, her screams echoed off the canyon walls like a wounded animal's cry. She was only 5 months along, far too early for the baby to survive, and the cramping pain that doubled her over felt like her body was tearing itself apart. Dakota burst through the cabin door, his usual caution forgotten in the face of her obvious distress. Without hesitation, he swept her into his arms and carried her to the bed, his scarred hands gentle as he examined her condition. When he saw the blood, his face went ashen, but his movements remained steady and sure. From the shelves, he gathered clean cloths, medicinal herbs, and instruments that looked suspiciously professional for a hermit's collection. As he worked, Ayanna realized that Dakota Stonebear possessed medical knowledge that rivaled any doctor she had ever encountered. Through hand gestures and drawings scratched in the dirt floor, he communicated what he needed her to do. "Drink this tea for the pain. Lie still. Breathe slowly." His touch was clinical yet caring as he treated her, and gradually the bleeding slowed, then stopped entirely. The cramping eased, and the baby's movements resumed their gentle flutter against her ribs. Dakota had saved both their lives with skills that seemed impossible for a supposed savage to possess. During her recovery, as she lay weak but grateful in the narrow bed, Ayanna began to piece together the mystery of the man who had become her unlikely savior. The medical supplies were too sophisticated, too complete for someone who had simply learned frontier doctoring. The way he handled instruments, prepared medicines, even the methodical approach to her care spoke of formal training. When she finally felt strong enough to ask, she drew pictures in the dust: a man in uniform, a building with a cross, hands helping wounded soldiers. Dakota's eyes filled with pain as he looked at her crude drawings, but slowly he nodded. Through gestures and more detailed sketches of his own, he told her his story in fragments. He had been a field surgeon during the Indian Wars, trained at a medical college back east before the violence claimed his voice and nearly his sanity. The bones around the cabin weren't trophies of murder, but the remains of desperate people who had come to him too late, victims of violence, disease, and starvation that even his skills couldn't overcome. The revelation explained so much. His gentle hands, his instinctive knowledge of her condition, the respectful way he had buried the dead. But it raised new questions about why a trained doctor was living as a hermit in the mountains, why he had stopped speaking, and what role Judge Whitehorse played in his exile. As Ayana's strength returned, she began teaching Dakota the sign language she had learned from a deaf student at the white school. His intelligence was formidable, and within days he was communicating complex thoughts through graceful hand movements. In return, he taught her the medicinal properties of desert plants, how to read the weather and cloud formations, and the subtle signs that revealed hidden water sources in the arid landscape. Their first real conversation, conducted entirely in signs, came 3 weeks after her bleeding scare. Sitting outside the cabin as the sun set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Ayana finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind. "Why don't you speak to white people?" Dakota's hands moved slowly, forming careful words in the gathering twilight. Spoke truth once, about sick children on reservation, about supplies never delivered, about women who disappeared. White men didn't want truth, wanted silence. His expression darkened. Judge's wife tried to help me prove corruption. Then she died. Very suddenly, very conveniently. The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Judge Whitehorse hadn't just been corrupt. He had been systematically eliminating anyone who threatened to expose his schemes. His Apache wife, Morning Star, had died not from illness, but from trying to reveal her husband's crimes. Dakota had retreated to the mountains not from cowardice, but from the knowledge that speaking truth in Copper Canyon was a death sentence. "The bones around here," Ayana signed, her hands trembling slightly. "Who were they?" "Apache women mostly, some white women too. Sent here by Judge, told their families they were dangerous, needed to be removed. I tried to save them all." His hands paused, and she could see the weight of failure in his posture. "Some were too broken, some too sick, some just gave up." He looked directly at her then, his dark eyes filled with fierce determination. "But not you. You're strong. You fight." As autumn deepened into winter, their relationship evolved from caregiver and patient to something approaching partnership. Ayana's pregnancy progressed normally, and she began to show prominently beneath her loosening dresses. Dakota carved toys and furniture for the coming child with the same meticulous care he applied to everything else. He built a larger bed frame, crafted a proper changing table, and even constructed a clever contraption that would keep bathwater warm in the cold months ahead. But it was the smaller gestures that revealed the depth of his character. He would leave wildflowers by her plate at breakfast, picked from secret gardens hidden in mountain crevices. He learned to cook Apache dishes that she craved, following recipes she taught him through patient demonstration. When her back ached from carrying the baby, he would massage the knotted muscles with oils infused with healing herbs, his touch always respectful and therapeutic. The first time she laughed, truly laughed, since David's betrayal, it was at Dakota's attempt to sign a joke about a clumsy jackrabbit. The sound startled them both, echoing strangely in the cabin that had known only sorrow for so long. When she saw his pleased smile in response, something warm and unexpected bloomed in her chest. This wasn't the hollow infatuation she had felt for David, built on pretty words and false promises. This was something deeper, rooted in shared hardship and mutual respect. Their growing closeness wasn't without complications. Sometimes she would catch him staring at her with an expression of such longing that it took her breath away, only to have him turn away the moment he realized she had noticed. She began to understand that despite his fierce exterior, Dakota Stonebear was afraid. Afraid of wanting something he believed he could never truly have. The truth about their impossible situation weighed heavily on both of them. She was legally his wife, but the marriage was a sham designed to punish her. He was her protector, but society would never accept their union as legitimate. They lived in a bubble of artificial domesticity that could burst at any moment if the outside world intruded. It was during one of these quiet evening conversations that Dakota revealed the full extent of Judge Whitehorse's corruption. Through careful questioning and his detailed responses, Ayanna learned that the judge had been selling Apache land rights to mining companies, skimming government supplies meant for the reservation, and systematically removing anyone who posed a threat to his schemes. The women sent to Dakota weren't just inconvenient pregnancies or social embarrassments, they were witnesses, truth-tellers, and anyone whose conscience might eventually prove troublesome. "How many?" she asked, dreading the answer. His hands moved slowly, reluctantly. "Over 3 years, 27 women, saved 14, lost 13. Each number was a weight he carried, she realized, a life he felt responsible for failing to preserve. The discovery of his hidden journal, written in a careful blend of English and Apache, revealed the systematic nature of Judge Whitehorse's operation. Names, dates, circumstances, all meticulously recorded by a man trained to document medical cases now documenting human tragedy. Some entries made her weep. Maria Gonzalez, age 16, died of infected wounds from beating, tried to save her for 6 days. Not enough. Others filled her with rage. Judge claims Rebecca Turner ran away. She never left the mountain. Buried her near the spring under white stones. As her due date approached, Ayanna found herself facing an impossible choice. She could remain in their mountain sanctuary, safe but isolated, raising her child in hiding from a world that would never accept them. Or she could find the courage to fight back, to use Dakota's carefully gathered evidence to expose the truth and bring justice to Copper Canyon, knowing it would likely cost them their lives. The decision was made for her when Dakota failed to return from his weekly trip to gather supplies in late November. As hours turned to days with no sign of him, Ayanna realized that their peaceful interlude was over. Judge Whitehorse had finally decided to eliminate the last witness to his crimes. The labor pains began during the worst thunderstorm in decades, as if the desert itself was screaming in sympathy with Ayanna's agony. Lightning split the sky in jagged silver veins while thunder shook the cabin walls, drowning out her cries as she gripped the bed frame with white knuckles. She had been alone for 3 days since Dakota's disappearance, rationing water and jerky while praying for his safe return. Now, as her body betrayed her with contractions that came like waves of fire, she realized her child would be born into this wilderness without the skilled hand she had come to depend on. But as another contraction tore through her, making her vision blur with pain, the cabin door burst open. Dakota stumbled inside, his clothes torn and bloodied, a fresh gash across his forehead still weeping crimson. His left arm hung at an awkward angle, clearly broken, but his eyes were alert and focused entirely on her distressed form writhing on the bed. Without hesitation, despite his obvious injuries, he began gathering the supplies they had carefully prepared for this moment. Clean cloths, boiled water kept warm by the fire, his medical instruments sterilized and ready. His movements were hampered by his broken arm, but his hands remained steady as he positioned himself to help deliver their child. Through gritted teeth and desperate sign language, he managed to communicate what she needed to do. The birth was brutal and complicated. The baby was breech, coming feet first in a position that could kill both mother and child without skilled intervention. Dakota worked with one functioning arm, his face a mask of concentration as he carefully maneuvered the infant into a safer position. Ayanna screamed until her throat was raw, certain she was going to die in this mountain cabin, far from her people and her ancestors. But Dakota's medical training prevailed. With gentle persistence and expert knowledge, he guided their daughter into the world as lightning illuminated the cabin like a photographer's flash. The baby emerged blue and silent, not breathing, and for a terrifying moment they thought they had lost her. Dakota immediately began the resuscitation techniques he had learned in field hospitals, clearing her airways and breathing life into her tiny lungs. The first cry that erupted from their daughter's throat was the most beautiful sound either of them had ever heard. She was perfect, tiny but healthy, with a shock of dark hair, and her mother's determined chin. As Dakota placed the screaming infant on Ayanna's chest, both parents wept openly, overwhelmed by the miracle of new life emerging from so much darkness. But their joy was short-lived. As Ayanna cradled her newborn daughter, she noticed riders approaching through the storm, dark silhouettes moving with military precision toward their hidden sanctuary. Dakota saw them too, and his expression hardened into something she had never seen before, pure protective fury. Judge Whitehorse rode at the head of 6 federal marshals, his face twisted with righteous satisfaction as he surveyed the scene through the cabin's open door. Behind him rode David Whitehorse, very much alive despite his supposed death months earlier, his golden hair now grown long and his face bearing the hard lines of someone who had been living rough in the wilderness. "Well, well," Judge Whitehorse called out, dismounting from his horse with theatrical flourish. "The savage and his squaw playing house in their mountain nest. How touching." His voice dripped with mockery as he gestured toward the marshals. "These gentlemen have come to arrest you both for the murder of my son and the theft of government property." Ayanna's blood ran cold as she realized the implications. David's staged death had been part of a larger scheme, allowing him to disappear while she took the blame for his supposed murder. The pregnancy that had seemed like evidence of her innocence was now being painted as proof of her guilt, the ultimate motive for killing the father of her child. "You see, gentlemen," Judge Whitehorse continued, his voice carrying the authority of law, "this Apache witch seduced my innocent boy, got herself with child, then murdered him when he tried to do the honorable thing and leave her. She's been hiding here with her cannibal lover, plotting further violence against decent Christian folk." David stepped forward then, his face a mask of false remorse. "Father's right," he said, his voice carrying easily over the wind. "She threatened to kill me if I didn't marry her. When I refused, she and this monster ambushed me. I barely escaped with my life." The lies rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, and Ayanna realized this had been planned from the beginning. Dakota stood slowly, cradling his broken arm, but his bearing remained proud and defiant. Though he couldn't speak, his presence filled the cabin doorway like an avenging spirit. The marshals shifted nervously, clearly uncomfortable with confronting the legendary man-eater face to face. "The baby changes everything," Judge Whitehorse announced with cruel satisfaction. "Half-breed bastards are wards of the state. The child will be taken to a proper Christian orphanage where she can be raised to serve civilized society." His smile was predatory as he added, "The parents, of course, will hang for their crimes." The word hang galvanized Dakota into action. Despite his injuries, he moved with deadly grace, positioning himself between the marshals and his family. His good hand found the rifle mounted above the fireplace, and suddenly the cabin erupted into chaos as men shouted orders and drew weapons. The first gunshot came from outside, one of the marshals firing into the air as a warning. But Dakota wasn't intimidated by displays of force. He had faced down Confederate cavalry charges and Apache war parties. 6 lawmen, even armed ones, didn't frighten a man who had nothing left to lose. "Stand down," the lead marshal shouted. "Drop your weapon and surrender peacefully." But Dakota's response was to level his rifle at Judge Whitehorse's chest. For the first time in months, his voice emerged in a hoarse whisper that carried the weight of accumulated fury. "No more lies, no more innocent blood. It ends here." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Ayanna clutched her newborn daughter, torn between hope and terror as she realized her silent protector had finally found his voice again. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains like the drums of war, and lightning revealed the faces of men about to make choices that would echo through eternity. Judge Whitehorse's confident facade cracked slightly as he found himself staring down the barrel of Dakota's rifle. "You're outnumbered 6-1, Savage. Even you can't kill us all." Dakota's smile was terrible to behold, full of knowledge earned in fields of blood and suffering. "Want to find out?" The cabin suddenly felt smaller, charged with violence waiting to explode. Ayanna knew that whatever happened next would determine not just their fate, but the fate of every woman who had been sent to the mountain before her. The evidence of Judge Whitehorse's crimes lay hidden throughout the cabin: his journal, the records, the proof that could bring down his entire corrupt empire. But first, they had to survive the next few minutes. As if summoned by the storm itself, new voices could be heard approaching through the rain, Apache war cries echoing off the canyon walls. Chief Nathan Crow Feather had come for his daughter, and he had not come alone. The sound of galloping horses and traditional war whoops filled the night as 24 Apache warriors surrounded the cabin, turning the tables on Judge Whitehorse's carefully planned ambush. The real battle was about to begin. The gunfire erupted like the storm itself, shattering the tense standoff as Lead Marshal Thompson made the fatal mistake of turning his weapon toward the newborn baby. Dakota's rifle spoke first, the bullet catching Thompson in the shoulder and spinning him around like a child's top. But the damage was done. The violence had been unleashed, and there would be no stopping it now. David Whitehorse, in a moment of panic-driven stupidity, drew his pistol and fired wildly at Dakota. The bullet went wide, splintering the cabin's wooden door frame, but it sealed his fate. Chief Nathan Crow Feather's war cry split the night as Apache arrows began raining down on the marshals from the darkness beyond the firelight. Ayanna pressed herself against the cabin's back wall, shielding her crying daughter with her own body as bullets shattered the windows and embedded themselves in the thick log walls. Through the chaos, she could see Dakota moving like a man possessed, his broken arm forgotten as he fought with the desperation of someone protecting his entire world. Judge Whitehorse's voice rose above the gunfire, screaming orders that no one could follow in the pandemonium. "Kill them all! Kill the savages and their spawn!" His mask of civilized authority had finally slipped completely, revealing the rabid hatred beneath. He emptied his revolver into the darkness, shooting at shadows and wind while his carefully planned operation dissolved into carnage around him. Marshal Rodriguez took an Apache arrow through his thigh and went down screaming, his rifle clattering across the rocky ground. Marshal Jenkins tried to make a run for his horse, but found himself face to face with 3 Apache warriors who had materialized from the storm like vengeful spirits. His scream was cut short by a war club that connected with his skull with a sickening crack. In the cabin, Dakota was reloading his rifle when David burst through the door, his face twisted with rage and fear. "This is all your fault, you red witch!" he snarled at Ayanna, raising his pistol toward her and the baby. "If you had just done what you were told, none of this would have happened." But before David could fire, Takota threw himself between them, taking the bullet meant for his family directly in the chest. The impact drove him backwards, blood blooming across his shirt like a crimson flower. He hit the floor hard, but somehow managed to keep his rifle, swinging it upward to catch David across the jaw with the wooden stock. David crumpled, his pistol spinning away into the corner of the cabin. Blood poured from his mouth where several teeth had been shattered, and his jaw hung at an unnatural angle. As he writhed on the floor, gasping and choking on his own blood, Ayanna saw her former lover clearly for the first time, not the golden-haired prince she had imagined, but a weak, cowardly man who would sacrifice anyone to save himself. Outside, the battle was turning decisively against the marshals. Chief Nathan had brought his finest warriors, men who had fought cavalry units and won, who could move through the desert like smoke and strike like lightning. Marshal Butler tried to surrender, throwing down his weapon and raising his hands, but an Apache lance took him through the heart before the words could leave his mouth. This was not a battle where quarter would be given or received. Takota struggled to his feet, one hand pressed against the spreading bloodstain on his chest, the other still gripping his rifle. His breathing was labored, and Ayanna could see the life draining from his eyes even as he fought to stay conscious. "The journal," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sounds of battle. "Under the floorboard, near the fireplace. Evidence." Judge Whitehorse appeared in the doorway then, his once pristine suit torn and muddy, his silver hair wild with panic. In his hand was a cavalry saber he had taken from one of the fallen marshals, its blade gleaming with fresh blood. "Enough!" he roared, advancing on the wounded Takota with murder in his eyes. "You've cost me everything, you savage son of a bitch. My operation, my reputation, my future, all destroyed because you couldn't mind your own business." The judge raised the saber for a killing blow, but Ayanna was already moving. Despite having given birth less than an hour earlier, despite her weakness and pain, maternal fury gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. She grabbed the iron poker from beside the fireplace and swung it with all her remaining energy. The poker caught Judge Whitehorse across the side of his head with a sound like a melon being split. He staggered sideways, dropping the saber as blood poured from his scalp. For a moment he stood swaying, his eyes unfocused and confused before toppling backward through the open door to land in the mud outside. David, meanwhile, had managed to crawl to where his pistol had fallen, his broken jaw making horrible grinding sounds as he moved. With one last surge of desperate malice, he raised the weapon toward Ayanna and her baby, determined to complete his father's work even as his own life ebbed away. The gunshot that ended David Whitehorse's life came not from his own weapon, but from Chief Nathan Crowfeather's rifle as the old chief appeared in the doorway like an avenging angel. David's body jerked once, then lay still, his sightless eyes staring at the cabin ceiling he would never see again. "My daughter," Chief Nathan said simply, lowering his smoking rifle as he stepped over David's corpse. His weathered face was streaked with war paint and blood, but his expression softened as he saw Ayanna holding her newborn child. "And my granddaughter." The silence that followed was broken only by the dying storm and the soft crying of the baby. Outside, the Apache warriors were finishing off the last of the marshals, ensuring that none would escape to bring reinforcements. Inside the cabin, 3 generations of the Crowfeather family looked at each other across a floor littered with bodies and broken dreams. Takota swayed on his feet, the bullet wound in his chest still bleeding freely. He tried to speak, to explain what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. His legs buckled, and he would have fallen if Chief Nathan hadn't caught him, supporting the wounded man with surprising gentleness. "You protected my daughter," the old chief said in perfect English, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You gave her child life, and you fought to defend them both." In the eyes of the Apache, You are my son now, whether the white man's law recognizes it or not." Ayanna looked down at her baby daughter, this tiny life that had emerged from so much death and violence. The child's eyes were open now, dark and alert, seeming to take in the chaos around her with unusual calm. She was the bridge between worlds that Ayanna had always been meant to be, but more than that, she was hope itself, proof that love could triumph over hatred, that life could flourish even in the harshest conditions. But as sirens began wailing in the distance, the cavalry was coming, drawn by the sound of gunfire. Ayanna realized their victory was temporary. Judge Whitehorse was still alive, still dangerous, and still possessed of enough political connections to turn this entire tragedy to his advantage. The real battle for justice was only beginning. As Chief Nathan helped Dakota toward the door, the wounded man gestured weakly toward the fireplace. "The evidence," he whispered again. "Everything is documented, every crime, every victim, every lie. The truth is all there." Ayanna understood. They had won the battle, but the war for their freedom, their lives, and their daughter's future would be fought in courtrooms and newspaper headlines. The journal hidden beneath the floorboards contained enough evidence to bring down not just Judge Whitehorse, but his entire network of corruption. The question was whether they would live long enough to present it. The woman who emerged from the shadows of the cabin's back room was like a ghost returning from the dead. Morning Star, Judge Whitehorse's supposedly deceased Apache wife, stepped into the firelight with the silent grace of someone who had spent 2 years perfecting the art of invisibility. Her dark hair was streaked with premature silver, and her once beautiful face bore the hardened lines of someone who had witnessed unspeakable horrors, but her eyes burned with the fire of long-awaited justice. "Hello, husband," she said in perfect English, her voice carrying the chill of winter wind across a graveyard. Judge Whitehorse, who had been struggling to his feet despite his head wound, froze as if he had seen his own death walking toward him. "Surprised to see me? You shouldn't be. I've been watching you for a very long time." The blood drained from Judge Whitehorse's face as he staggered backward, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that was no longer there. "You're dead," he whispered, his voice cracking like thin ice. "I saw your body. I buried you myself." Morning Star's laugh was bitter as desert wind. "You buried Maria Santos, the Mexican woman you murdered when she threatened to expose your trafficking operation. You told everyone it was me, your grieving Apache wife who had died of a fever. But I was already hidden in these mountains, gathering evidence of every crime you've committed." From beneath her worn buckskin dress, Morning Star produced a leather satchel that bulged with documents, photographs, and correspondence. 2 years of watching, recording, documenting every woman you sent to die, every bribe you took, every lie you told. I have it all, Ezekiel. Your entire empire of blood and corruption ready to be delivered to the territorial governor and the federal authorities. The revelation hit Ayanna like a physical blow. All this time, while she had been living with Dakota, learning to trust and eventually love him, Morning Star had been their guardian angel, watching from the shadows and preparing for this moment of reckoning. The mysterious supplies that sometimes appeared, the sense of being protected by unseen forces, the feeling that they were never truly alone. It had all been Morning Star's doing. Judge Whitehorse's composure cracked completely as the magnitude of his exposure became clear. "You Apache witch!" he snarled, spittle flying from his lips. "You think anyone will believe the word of a savage squaw over a federal judge? I'll have you hanged for the murders that happened here tonight." But Morning Star was already shaking her head, her expression calm despite the fury burning in her dark eyes. "They'll believe the word of Captain Jonathan Hartwell of the Territorial Investigation Unit, who has been conducting a secret federal investigation into corruption in Arizona Territory. They'll believe the sworn statements of 14 women you thought were dead. They'll believe the documented evidence of your mining frauds, your theft of government supplies, and your systematic elimination of witnesses. As if summoned by her words, new riders appeared at the edge of the firelight. Not cavalry troops, as everyone had expected, but federal investigators wearing the distinctive badges of the U.S. Marshal Service. Captain Hartwell, a lean man with steel-gray hair and eyes like winter ice, dismounted and surveyed the carnage with professional detachment. "Judge Ezekiel Whitehorse," Captain Hartwell announced, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, murder, human trafficking, fraud, and treason against the United States government. The evidence against you is overwhelming and irrefutable." The judge's last desperate gambit was to point at the Apache warriors surrounding the cabin. "These savages attacked federal marshals. They murdered law enforcement officers in the course of their duties. You have to arrest them." Captain Hartwell's expression didn't change as he examined the scene more carefully. "What I see here is a group of Apache citizens defending themselves and their family against an illegal assault by corrupt officials. The marshals you brought here tonight were acting under false pretenses, armed with fraudulent warrants, attempting to kidnap a newborn child and murder its parents. Their deaths were justified under territorial law." The truth was even more stunning than anyone had imagined. The federal government had been investigating Judge Whitehorse for over a year, following a trail of missing persons reports and suspicious land deals that stretched across 3 territories. Morningstar had been their primary informant, faking her own death to go underground and gather the evidence needed to bring down the entire corruption network. "The women you sent to the mountains," Morningstar continued, her voice steady despite the emotion underlying her words, "I helped most of them escape to safety. The ones who chose to stay became part of our network, gathering intelligence and helping other victims. We've been building a case against you piece by piece, waiting for the moment when we could strike decisively." Dakota, who had been listening to this revelation while Chief Nathan tended to his bullet wound, managed to speak despite his pain. "The journal under the floorboard," he whispered. "My medical records of the women's injuries, documentation of their stories, proof of systematic abuse." Captain Hartwell nodded approvingly. "Dr. Stonebear's records have been invaluable to our investigation. His medical training and meticulous documentation provided crucial evidence that corroborated the survivors' testimonies. Without his work, we might never have been able to build such a comprehensive case." The moment of ultimate revelation came when Morningstar opened her satchel and began removing documents that painted a picture of corruption so vast it staggered the imagination. Judge Whitehorse hadn't just been trafficking women. He had been selling Apache land rights to mining companies, skimming government funds meant for the reservation, and systematically murdering anyone who threatened to expose his operations. "Your son David was supposed to be part of your succession plan," Morningstar said, her voice cutting through the night air like a blade. "You faked his death to remove him from the corruption investigation, planning to bring him back later with a new identity. But he got greedy, didn't he? Started making demands, threatening to expose you if you didn't give him a larger share of the profits." Judge Whitehorse's face went gray as the full scope of his exposure became clear. His own son's betrayal, his wife's resurrection from the dead, the federal investigation, the collapse of his carefully constructed empire, it was all too much for his mind to process. "I was protecting civilization," he screamed, his voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "These savages were a threat to progress, to order, to everything decent people are trying to build in this territory. I did what was necessary to preserve the future." Captain Hartwell's response was quietly devastating. "What you did was commit crimes against humanity for personal profit. You betrayed your oath as a judge, violated federal law, and murdered innocent people. There is no justification for what you've done, and there will be no mercy in your punishment." As federal agents moved to place Judge Whitehorse in shackles, Ayanna realized that the nightmare that had begun with her forced marriage was finally ending. But more than that, she understood now that she had been part of something much larger than her own personal tragedy, her suffering, Dakota's exile, Morning Star's sacrifice. They had all been threads in a tapestry of justice that was finally being woven complete. The baby in her arms stirred, opening her dark eyes to look up at her mother's face. In that gaze, Ayanna saw not just her own future, but the future of all the women who had been silenced, all the voices that had been stolen, all the lives that had been discarded like refuse. Her daughter would grow up in a world where truth mattered, where courage was rewarded, where love could triumph over hatred. As the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, Ayanna realized that the darkest night of her life had given birth to the brightest hope she had ever known. The mountain that had been her prison had become her sanctuary, and the man she had feared had become her salvation. The truth had set them all free. 5 years later, the sound of children's laughter echoed across the valley where Copper Canyon had once festered with corruption. The town had been renamed New Haven, and it bore little resemblance to the place of fear and oppression it had once been. Where Judge Whitehorse's courthouse had stood, a new building housed a medical clinic and school, with classes taught in both English and Apache. The transformation had been as complete as it was miraculous. Ayanna Stone Bear stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching her daughter Hope chase butterflies through the wildflower meadow that had replaced the bone-scattered clearing. At 5 years old, Hope was a perfect blend of her parents' best qualities. She had inherited Ayanna's quick intelligence and fierce spirit, combined with Dakota's gentle nature and healing hands. The child spoke 3 languages fluently and could identify medicinal plants with the expertise of a trained botanist. "She's going to be a doctor like her father," Morning Star observed, joining Ayanna on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. The former ghost had become the family's beloved grandmother figure, her own healing aided by watching Hope grow into everything the future could offer. "Look how carefully she examines each flower before picking it." Dakota emerged from the clinic he had built adjacent to their home, his movements still slightly favored on his left side where David's bullet had done permanent damage. But his eyes were bright with purpose as he dried his hands on a clean towel. His patient today had been Maria Santos's daughter, fully recovered from the pneumonia that would have killed her in the old Copper Canyon, where medicine was rationed by prejudice and profit. "The territorial governor is coming next month for the dedication ceremony," he announced, his voice strong and clear. Years of speaking again had restored his confidence along with his vocal cords. "He wants to make New Haven the model for territorial integration policy, Apache and white settlements working together as one community." The dedication ceremony was for the monument they had built to honor the 27 women who had been sent to the mountain. 14 of them were still alive, scattered across the territory but connected by bonds forged in shared survival. 13 were remembered in carved stone, their names finally spoken aloud, and their stories preserved for future generations. Chief Nathan Crow Feather, now in his 70s but still vital, rode up the path with his weekly delivery of news from the reservation. The old chief had become something of a celebrity in territorial politics, his wisdom sought by officials who had once dismissed him as an irrelevant savage. His granddaughter ran to meet him with the uninhibited joy that had become her trademark. "Grandfather, grandfather!" "I learned a new song," Hope called out in Apache, her small hands already reaching to help him dismount. The bond between them was magical to witness. The aging chief and the mixed-blood child who represented everything he had fought to preserve and everything he hoped to see in the future. "Tell me, little morning bird," Chief Nathan replied, switching to English for the benefit of the adults. What song has captured your heart today? Hope's answer came in a clear, sweet voice that carried across the valley as she sang a traditional Apache blessing song, but with new verses that she and her classmates had composed about friendship between peoples. The words spoke of eagles and doves flying together, of different colored flowers growing in the same garden, of streams flowing from different mountains but joining to water the same desert. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the territorial physician who had come to establish the medical college that would bear Tekota's name, arrived shortly after with a wagon full of supplies and her usual boundless enthusiasm. She had been one of the first people to recognize that the mountain hermit possessed medical knowledge that rivaled any university-trained doctor in the territory. "The teaching hospital funding has been approved," she announced, her joy infectious as she embraced the entire family. "We'll break ground next spring, and by this time next year, we'll be training the first class of Native American physicians in territorial history. Tekota, you'll be the head of surgery, of course." The success of their integrated community had attracted attention from across the nation. Journalists came to write about the miracle of New Haven, where former enemies had become neighbors, where justice had replaced corruption, and where hope had literally been born from despair. Harper's Weekly had featured Hope on their cover, calling her the face of America's future. But for all the public attention and political success, the moments Ayanna treasured most were the quiet ones. Evening meals around their expanded table, with Morningstar telling traditional stories while Tekota added scientific explanations that somehow made the magic more wonderful rather than less. Bedtime routines where Hope insisted on checking the clinic to make sure all the patients were comfortable before she would sleep. Sunday gatherings where the entire community came together for shared meals and celebration. "Do you ever miss the silence?" Ayanna asked Tekota one evening as they walked hand in hand through the town square, Hope skipping ahead of them while pointing out constellations she had learned from her grandfather. Tekota considered the question seriously, as he did all things. "I miss the peace of it sometimes," he admitted. "But I've learned that silence can be its own kind of prison. Speaking truth, even when it's difficult, even when it costs us something. That's how we honor the people who couldn't speak for themselves." Their conversation was interrupted by Hope running back to them, her face bright with excitement. "Mama, Papa, look! The evening star is extra bright tonight. Grandfather says that means someone we love is watching over us from the spirit world." Ayanna knelt to gather her daughter into her arms, feeling the weight of all the choices that had led to this moment. David's betrayal, her father's impossible decision, the terror of those first days with Tekota, the violence that had nearly destroyed them all. It had led to this, to love that was deeper than passion, to family that was stronger than blood, to hope that was more enduring than fear. "Who do you think is watching over us?" she asked Hope, smoothing back the child's dark hair. Hope's answer came without hesitation, delivered with the absolute certainty that only children possess. "All of them, Mama. All the women who came before us. All the people who were brave when being brave was dangerous. They're all there in the star, making sure we remember their stories and making sure we keep telling them." As they walked home through the peaceful streets of New Haven, past the school where children of different backgrounds learned together, past the clinic where healing was offered without regard to race or ability to pay, past the monument where names were carved in stone but memories lived on in the hearts of the living, Ayanna realized that the greatest victory wasn't the destruction of Judge Whitehorse's empire or even the creation of their model community. The greatest victory was this: a little girl who could look at the evening star and see not tragedy but triumph, not endings but beginnings. Not the past that had been taken from them, but the future they had built together. Love had not just conquered hatred, it had transformed it into something beautiful. Sometimes life throws us curveballs we never saw coming. Betrayal from those we trusted, judgment from our communities, moments when everything we believed about fairness and justice crumbles around us. Like Ayana, many of us have faced times when we felt abandoned, misunderstood, or punished for circumstances beyond our control. But here's what I've learned from stories like hers. Our darkest chapters don't have to define our ending. The mountain that was meant to be Ayana's prison became her sanctuary. The man she feared became her greatest love. The child born from scandal became a bridge to healing. Sometimes what breaks us also breaks us open to deeper compassion, stronger love, and purpose we never imagined possible. At 55, 60, or beyond, we're not too old to write new chapters. We're not too set in our ways to find unexpected joy. The courage it takes to start over, to trust again, to believe in second chances. That's not just for the young. Your story isn't over. What mountain in your life became an unexpected blessing? Have you ever discovered that what seemed like punishment was actually preparation for something beautiful? Share your thoughts below. Your wisdom might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.